Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Rati here. So guys, I have made an entire series on how to write a poetry book. I've made so many videos on this topic. You can check out my YouTube channel and I'm going to provide the links in the description. But today in this video, I'm going to talk about how to get a poetry book published, how to publish a poetry book. And I'm going to talk about this from my own specific experience. I've got 2 poetry books published till now. So I'm just going to talk about my experiences in the context of getting my poetry books published and, things which I think are going to be useful for you as well. So hope you like the video and learn something from my experiences. So I've got 2 poetry books published till now. My first poetry book, The Sunset Sonata, has been published by Sahitya Akademi, India's National Academy of Letters. And my second poetry book, I'd Like a Bit of the Moon, has been recently published by Red River, which is an independent poetry publishing house specifically catering to poetry publishing. And Red River is based in Delhi. Of course, I live in India, so I'm going to talk about Indian publishing houses, Indian poetry publishers. Both of these are Indian poetry publishers. So let me talk about my first book, The Sunset Sonata, and how I managed to get this book published by Sahitya Akademi. Now, Sahitya Akademi, guys, is a very prestigious organization, In fact, it's India's National Academy of Letters. So, everybody was asking me this question in this recent event, which I attended as a writer. Book Nerds Women Writers Hangout, that how come Sahitya Akademi published such a young author? Because they generally published very experienced people. So I want to share this with you that Sahitya Akademi has a scheme for publishing the first book of a young author. It's called the Navodaya Scheme. If you just Google Sahitya Akademi and go onto their website, you will find the links to the scheme. I think sometime in April or May you can start applying for the scheme. Every year they have a deadline. So you're just literally going to have to email them and send them your manuscript. And it's meant for the first book of a young author. And the age limit is pretty relaxed. So the higher age limit is 40. So, if you are below 40 years or I think even of 40 years of age, you can apply for this scheme. And it's not just meant for poetry, but for books in other genres as well, non-fiction, fiction, I suppose. So you can definitely check out this scheme. I think for it's a great opportunity to get published for young authors in India, the Sahitya Akademi scheme, to get their poetry published. That's how I got my poetry published. And I think I was just plain lucky. I just, applied for the scheme and my poems got selected. So that's about my first book. Sahitya Akademi, of course, is a government publishing house. And if I were to list the cons, they do not do much in terms of promoting your book. Because it's kind of very traditional publishing and they don't put really, all the books on Amazon for sale, which I think it's a bit of a drawback in terms of, sort of people wanting to buy your books and how do you actually sell your books. But otherwise, I would say it's a very prestigious platform for, you getting noticed in the world of poetry publishing. So I would definitely recommend that you apply to Sahitya Akademi. My second book, I'd Like a Bit of the Moon, which I got published by Red River. Now, Red River is an independent poetry press, which is relatively new, just a couple of years back it was set up, but it's published some amazing poetry collections in this time, including some very famous Indian English authors. And the speciality of Red River is, and I'm not just saying it, because my poetry book got published from there, but just generally the speciality of Red River publications is that it's started by somebody who is a poet himself. And I think that really makes a great deal of difference. A publishing house, a poetry publishing house, I think, which is run by a poet himself, it makes a lot of difference in terms of how your poetry is understood, how it is edited, and how it's presented. So that's one thing. Now, coming to my tips for publishing, to aspiring poets, how to get a poetry book published. My first advice to you would be, before you even think of getting your poems together in book form and start approaching publishers, what you really have to do is you have to, make yourself very visible in literary public spaces. Join a local writers circle in your city or, make yourself very visible at literary meets, attend poetry readings, literary events, and just generally make yourself visible. Because, guys, the way things work in India, and I think even abroad as well, it's not like you form a list of publishing houses from the internet and you start emailing your manuscripts to them and they would notice you. It's very difficult to go through that route. So, the much, the more sensible way of going about it is to sort of network and form valuable contacts by being genuinely sort of interested in other poets and meeting them, networking with them, and attending these poetry events and performances. And I can vouch for that because it worked for me. Although I wasn't really doing it deliberately, I was so passionate about poetry, and I was in a city, I was in Delhi, where all these things were happening so much on such a huge scale that I automatically became a part of many poetry events. And that's how I got my opportunities for publication, both my first book and my second book, I'd say. I can understand that though, if you live in a small city, a small town, the opportunities might be limited for, sort of real life events, but you should grab every opportunity. And in case those opportunities are not present in your city in terms of, events happening offline, you should leverage then the power of social media and online. Make yourself visible out there, put your poetry out on YouTube and Instagram, if nothing else. And these days, social media is a very potent tool for connecting with authors, all kinds of authors, famous authors, upcoming authors. So just use this opportunity to widely network, even if you are living in a place where these kinds of events are not happening offline. Use the power of social media, leverage the power of social media to widely network and sort of make yourself generally visible, like really visible, because the world has transformed a lot over the past couple of years. A couple of years back, like, my advice to you would have been different. It would have been more like, you should get your poems published in literary magazines and slowly build a portfolio, and then you should start approaching poetry publishers for getting your book published. But now the world has changed dynamically, dramatically over the past 5-6 years. So now it's all about social media and making yourself visible. So even you don't have to really wait for, sort of magazines to publish your poetry. What you can just do is to sort of like start putting your poems, like I said, on YouTube and Instagram and make yourself really visible. So that's the second point, that leverage the power of social media even before you think of publishing your book. Trust me, through leveraging the power of social media and by attending real life offline poetry events and stuff, and just generally, meeting authors and poets, you're going to get a lot more opportunities in terms of getting your book published than you would get just sitting at your home and, applying online and stuff. The third point that I want to mention, in terms of getting your poetry book published, and my personal advice to you would be to not wait for some big publishing house to notice your work and publish your poetry. A lot of us, obviously, we are very ambitious. So a lot of us have this thing that, if my poetry gets published, it's my first book, so it has to be very special. So only Penguin or HarperCollins or somebody will publish my book. Otherwise, I'll just wait. So I would say that, the world is moving very fast, and so it's the world of publishing. There's no point waiting for 10 years or so to to have some big publisher notice you. First of all, let me tell you the reality. These big publishers like HarperCollins and Rupa, they hardly publish poetry. They hardly notice you unless you're already a big shot, unless you're already a celebrity in some other domain, or you have, some kind of hi-fi contacts. So I'm not being cynical, but you would just waste your time by sending your manuscripts to, these kind of big publishing houses in the beginning of your poetic journey. So I would strongly advise you to look for independent poetry presses, small publishing houses, and submit your poetry to them, who are sort of genuinely interested, or who are specifically catering to sort of like, poetry manuscripts more than other genres. And then I think the chances of you being successful in getting your book published are more. I'm also going to share some names of some poetry publishers in India. I'm going to give you some screenshots, or just, share in terms of writing. So that would be my advice to you. The fourth point I'd like to mention is that, you don't have to even wait for somebody else to publish your book. If you are having a really hard time and if you're struggling, to find a publisher for your book, for a poetry publisher for your book, then you just go ahead and self-publish it. I know it sounds a bit risky, self-publishing, but trust me guys, I think it really works. And by self-publishing here, I mean strictly self-publishing, There are two kinds of self-publishing. One is that you have these self-publishing companies, which are pretty much like publishing houses. And that's also another very confusing thing when Google poetry publishing in India on the internet, then a lot of these self-publishing ventures will come up, which are basically like, those PR kind of self-publishing companies, which would sort of take a certain fees from you and then, sort of ready your manuscript, market you and do everything. But technically it's self-publishing. So you have to be very careful, you have to distinguish between self-publishing and a conventional publishing house. So I would strongly suggest you. So like I said, there are two ways of self-publishing. One is going through these self-publishing companies like Notion Press, for example. The second way is to just literally self-publish yourself, as in, you sort of the designing and the layout, everything is taken care by everything you spend money on your own, and you just do all the stuff on your own, and then you put out the book on Amazon for sale. You collaborate with Amazon. I'm going to make a different video about it. I think there's a certain procedure of doing it. So I think, although it might seem like a headache to do everything on your own, but I think in terms of, earning money from your poetry, this is the best deal ever, because literally everything, all the money you're going to earn from your poetry is going to be your own. You don't have to give any percentage to anybody, because trust me, whether you get your poetry published from a conventional publisher or, by these self-publishing ventures, they will take a huge chunk of your earnings. So you're literally left with peanuts in terms of royalty. So I would say, if you're confident about selling your poetry books and you have a pretty good network, you've already built a fan following through social media, then self-publishing your book literally on your own and putting it out there on Amazon is a good idea, because you're going to earn something as a poet. Now, of course, guys, this is only going to work if you already have some credibility, and if you have already built a considerable fan following of your poetry. You will obviously struggle to sell your poems if nobody knows you. So I think self-publishing is more for people, like I said, who have already worked hard on branding themselves. So that's why I'm repeating this, that before you decide to get a poetry book published, at least you need to spend at least 1 year, branding yourself as a poet and being visible, like being really visible and sort of building some kind of audience. 1 year is the minimum time, I think, but otherwise you need to spend like 2-3 years doing this hardcore thing before you actually publish your book. One last advice that I would give to you is to look for a publisher. Try and look for a poetry publisher in your town, because, if somebody from your local place publishes your poetry, then the opportunities for, organizing events, and in terms of logistics, the practicality of you doing book promotions is more. So poetry is anyways, a bit of a niche genre. So I would say that as a beginner poet, instead of trying to go all over the place, it's better if you concentrate on selling your books in your local area. I think you would be more successful than, as compared to if you're just targeting, a new author, and you're just targeting the whole country and you're too ambitious and you want to sell millions of copies to Amazon. It doesn't work like that. Obviously if you're lucky, then anything can happen. But otherwise, a good strategy is to select a local publisher and concentrate on selling your poetry books locally, on promoting your poetry books, locally, rather than taking a pan-Indian approach. You can slowly move to the pan-Indian approach once you, start creating some name as a poet, and once you start getting popular as a poet. So lastly, I would just like to say that, like I said, self-publishing is a game changer these days. And self-publishing doesn't really mean, that you're branded like, as a nobody, you cannot be published by others. A lot of famous authors, a lot of famous poets, first they self-published, and when they came into the limelight, then their books were published by mainstream publishers. Like I think Rupi Kaur, for example, who is such a sensation on Instagram, and she's earning like, so much of money as a poet, which probably no other poet is earning in this day in the world. Rupi Kaur, I think, started self-publishing her work before her books were noticed, and then she became a really big name, and then of course now she's picked up by all big publishers. So this is my advice to you for getting your poetry book published. I just shared my experiences from my own poetry books. I'd Like a Bit of the Moon and the Sunset Sonata. So I hope you like the video, guys. If you have any suggestions on, more advice which you want to get from me regarding poetry publishing, like I said, I'm going to make one more video separately on self-publishing. And so do watch out this section for other videos related to poetry publishing. Thanks for watching, and please do subscribe to the channel if you like the content, and please do press the like button. Thanks for listening.